The monstrous feminine is a term coined by none other than Barbara Creed. She created the concept in her book, The Monstrous Feminine, Film, Feminism, Psychoanalysis in 1993, where she examines the role of women in horror films, challenging the dominant patriarchal view which frequently puts the woman in the position of the victim. It is a term that has been continued to be used in modern media to analyze the misunderstood characters reclaiming the genre through the monstrous feminine, such as Carrie and Ginger from Ginger Snaps, two characters in which I will also be talking about in this essay. We will discuss femininity and menstruation turned into monstrosity, as well as focusing on the monstrous feminine tropes, the witch and the lesbian vampire. People say horror has been good for female roles, as they have been the lead in more than any other genre, but I think it's hard to argue that horror has ever been kind to women, so I think it's important to understand how we got to this point. Let's start with some women in film history. Alice Guy Blanche, as well as being the first female director, was also one of the first to embrace the horror genre, creating adaptations of Edgar Allan Poe, The Pit, and The Pendulum. She also created a film called The Girl and the Vampire, and has been one of the biggest inspirations behind Alfred Hitchcock. Yes, I know, one of the most sexist directors ever.
Ironic, isn't it?
So why has Alice Blanche almost been erased from history? Women have always been dismissed and overlooked in the horror genre. Daphne du Maurier wrote in the horror genre even though at the time she was considered a romance novelist. In the 1920s to 1930s, this was the era of horror trying to decide what it was. This led to mostly lead roles being male-dominated, with plenty of damsel in distresses and for some reason a lot of vampires. These films included Nosferatu, Vampire, Freaks, and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. It wasn't until the release of later films such as Rosemary's Baby, The Hunger, and I Spit on Your Grave that females started being cast as lead-facing roles. There is an argument of why this genre attracted more female leads than others. Why horror? Why not action, comedy, or mystery? One theory is that having an audience when watching horror, it's important for us to have something to fear, but more importantly, someone to fear for. And what gender does society view as the most fragile? Females. I mean, we're already scared walking home in the dark at night. How about they make a film with a serial killer chasing after a man for once? Majority of films such as The Shining, Psycho, and Scream were made by male directors and writers, creating the torture and punishment for the female protagonists. According to a Molitor and Spolsky case study, it takes women twice as long to die in horror films than men, prolonging the torture of the woman. So we can argue that the prolonged torture of the woman within these films and the victimizing could be for the enjoyment of the male gaze. In recent years, with this new idealism of elevated horror, there is an argument that women aren't always the victim within horror, but if they aren't always the victim, then what are they? But in saying that, even for a character being the monstrous feminine, they were the victim at least at one point in the plot. They are written as the victim becoming the villain, whether it's being sacrificed in a ritual, sexually assaulted, bullied, or even having your period. Menstruation has always been a taboo subject in society and media. Thinking back to biblical texts, it was men who deemed the cycle disgusting within society. According to the Palgrave Handbook of Critical Menstruation Studies, they state that in the Hebrew Bible, aka the Old Testament in Christianity, the first book, Genesis, explains that the mythical first woman, Eve, disobeyed her God by eating a forbidden apple, while Genesis names the pain of childbirth, not menstruation, as the curse for Eve's transgression. The Bible's third book, Leviticus, mentions the pain of menstruation and lists required and forbidden activities for menstruating women, perhaps building on early Mesopotamian ideas about purity. Generations of Bible readers, both Jewish and later Christians, have associated the two stories such that menstruation is widely considered and named a curse like childbirth. Through these old biblical statements, it has continued to remain in society's views that menstruation is a curse that should not be acknowledged but to be hidden. Many male directors have used the menstruation cycle in horror to show the start of growing up as a woman and turning it into a hex. Menstruation in horror has been linked with the lesbian vampire in many cases, such as Ginger in Ginger Snaps and A Girl Walks Home at Night. We see this in films created by male directors such as Carrie in Ginger Snaps. Ginger is a social outcast. In Ginger Snaps, the day Ginger got her period, she was bitten by a werewolf that same night and cursed with the fate of transforming into one herself. I don't think you get more obvious abuse of the menstruation cycle than that. Ginger's transformation between human and non-human is tracked by the marking of her calendar for her cycle, a link between the blood and the moon. As her transformation begins, she starts growing fur, a tail, and claws, while at the same time becomes more attractive to her male classmates. She has become the abject as the curse of menstruation and puberty takes over, provoking the fear of male and female. Emphasizing that woman, because of her reproductive capabilities, is not far removed from the world of nature. Her generative functions position her on the side of the object. By framing menstruation and puberty along with the curse of being a werewolf, she also becomes more sexually active. As the curse gets stronger, she takes pleasure in harming these men by seducing them. Ginger's sexual desires are directly linked with her new monstrous traits as a werewolf, suggesting that female sexuality is something that is destructive and dangerous, something to be feared. The fear in males is apparent with the lack of understanding of what it means for a female to grow into her own skin, as well as the fear in females by their bodies taking control and being overtaken by sexual objectification from others. From classical to Renaissance times, the uterus was frequently drawn with horns to demonstrate its supposed association with the devil, says Barbara Creed. At the end of the film, Ginger's sister must kill Ginger in order to restore justice. Virgin women and women who are deemed as more pure seem to be the only ones who are allowed to survive, while other female characters who are more sexually and quote-unquote sinful are the ones who are punished and killed. By killing these characters, it's containing and restraining the female sexuality and monstrosity. The thought of a female embracing her sexuality as destroying societal norms is the true terror of the male gaze in these films. What makes the monstrous feminine so apparently terrifying is not her actions within themselves, but her power to mutilate and transform a vulnerable male. We see this in Ginger Snaps, wherein Ginger's transformation gave her masculine traits. Jason's transformation can be linked to female puberty, as blood appears as he pees. He is stripped of his masculinity. Ginger reverses the role between men and women, and as Barbara Creed states, the monstrous feminine is terrifying, not because she is castrated, but because she castrates. This is where the lesbian vampire also comes into play, as this trope threatens patriarchal norms. It doesn't fit into society, so they don't know what to do except fear and repress it. The lesbian vampire was created by Barbara Creed, and we can interpret it as the power of female relationships, and not only in a romantic way. Creed states that the female vampire is abject because she disrupts identity and order. Driven by her lust for blood, she does not respect the dictates of the law, which set down the rules of proper sexual conduct. It's an idea that women turning to each other means that they triumph over men and destroy men themselves. To express a fundamental male fear that woman bonding will exclude men and threaten male supremacy. Throughout the film, Ginger's sister Bridget was always protecting Ginger, trying to break the curse and aiding her through her transformation. They helped defend each other no matter what, and even when Ginger's transformation was complete and she was a werewolf, Bridget only killed Ginger as a last resort. In Carrie, the film also commences with the start of her period and also acts as the catalyst for her powers. Shelley Stamp states that, by mapping the supernatural onto female adolescence and engaging the language of the fantastic, Carrie represents a masculine fantasy in which the feminine is constituted as horrific. The film's obsession with blood keeps noting towards the menstrual blood to showcase her supernatural powers, again depicting menstrual blood to be a terrifying element of the female body. Linking her menstruation to monstrosity. As her powers grow, so does her feminine exterior. Through the influence of her teacher, she starts applying makeup and dressing in society's definition of feminine to blend in with the rest of her peers. Slowly breaking free of the sexual repression thoughts her mother has placed on her. The monstrosity is something that we think needs to be concealed, but the longer Carrie tries to suppress this difference within her, the more it starts to emerge. Shelley Stamp describes the film as, Carrie is not about liberation from sexual repression, but about the failure to contain the monstrous feminine. If you treat women like monsters, then that's what they'll become. And linking back to Mulvey's philosophy of the male gaze, even though Carrie is driving the action, there is still a male gaze directed behind the camera. She is still objectified throughout the entire film, even from the opening image of a collection of shots breaking down her body in the shower. And even though we have scenes where we sympathize with Carrie being bullied, the film still ends with no happy ending for Carrie as she remains humiliated and devastated. It's also important to acknowledge the lack of diversity within females they cast for horror, as they only cast one definition of femininity. The leads are always cis, white, and society's ideal feminine. Once again, this is due to the male gaze only knowing femininity to be one thing and carrying this ideal girl throughout the genre. Carrie also represents the trope of the witch, like the lesbian vampire, a trope created by Barbara Creed. Representation of the witch continues to foreground her essentially sexual nature. She is usually depicted as a monstrous figure with supernatural powers and a desire for evil. The male gaze demonizes the feminine reproductive system and morphs it into potential evil and a danger to society. Her relationship to nature is stronger than man, and her controlling forces of nature are seen as evil powers of femininity. Going back to Shelley Doyle's statement, a monster is not something to dismiss or look down on. A monster does not merely inspire anger or disgust. A monster, by definition, inspires fear. The women within these films aren't monsters, they are just defending themselves. And for female viewers, they may feel empowered, and for male viewers, they may feel threatened. Like Ginger Snaps, Carrie also dies at the end of the film, as her character once again is punished for starting to embrace her feminine sexuality. While women are shamed and demonized for embracing their sexuality, men are praised. They are intended as warnings about what happens when women aspire beyond what we allowed. Overall, horror interprets the female menstruation cycle as something unnatural and out of the ordinary, stripping it of what it really is and leaving us with these monstrous ideologies of the female reproductive system. Male film directors and writers are still creating these characters for the male gaze, leaving us with one depiction of femininity. Both Ginger Snaps and Carrie are films that use feminine sexuality and menstruation to demonize them as characters of danger and destruction. Their punishment at the end of the film for embracing their sexuality and monstrous feminine is death, as they are not allowed to have a happy ending according to classic horror tradition, while the pure are allowed to survive.